So, when you think of a revolution, you probably picture swords and armies, right? Well, in medieval India, something massive was brewing. But this was a totally different kind of revolution. It was a revolution of the heart, one fought with poetry, with song, and with this incredible new idea about how we connect to the divine. Let's get right into it. And that really brings us to the big question here. In a world totally tangled up in rigid rules and complicated rituals, how did God become a personal friend? How did faith suddenly become this deeply personal, emotional thing that was open to absolutely everyone? That's what we're going to unpack. And believe me, this was a huge shift. I mean, a seismic one. We're talking about moving away from these super elaborate, exclusive ceremonies that were all in Sanskrit, a language that, let's be honest, most people didn't even understand. And instead, this whole new path just opens up, a direct, emotional line to God, expressed in the languages people actually spoke every day. You know, Tamil, Kannada, Hindi, the real languages of the people. Okay, so it's really important to get this straight. This wasn't some single organized movement with a leader and a manifesto. No way. It was more like a vibrant mosaic, a spiritual explosion, really. Think of it like a bunch of different rivers all flowing towards the same ocean. They were all asking similar big questions, but they came up with all these wonderfully different answers. So, if we're looking at this road of devotion, the first big fork you come to is this idea of saguna versus nirguna. On one side, you've got saguna bhakti. This is devotion to a god with attributes, with a form, a deity you can actually picture, right? Like Shiva as a dancer or Vishnu as a protector. But then on the other side, you have nirguna, and that's devotion to a god who is completely formless, totally abstract, something so vast it's beyond any image or description we could ever come up with. So where did this all start? Well, the very first sparks of this fire came from the south. You had these incredible poet saints, the Alvars, who were all about Vishnu, and the Nayanars, who were devoted to Shiva. These weren't priests locked away in temples. No, they were wanderers. They took their faith directly to the people, singing these stunningly beautiful hymns in the local language, in Tamil. And here's the really mind-blowing part. Their songs were seen as just as sacred as the ancient Sanskrit Vedas. Plus, and this is huge, they welcomed everyone. People from all social backgrounds, even from castes considered untouchable. This wasn't just a spiritual revolution, it was a social one. And that's the thing you have to remember. This was never just about personal faith. It was a direct, head-on challenge to the way things were. Through their poems, through the way they lived their lives, these saints were basically questioning the entire system, the rigid caste hierarchy, the empty rituals, the patriarchal structure. They were true rebels. Wow. Just listen to this quote from Basavana, a leader from 12th century Karnataka. It is just so powerful. When they see a serpent carved in stone, they pour milk on it. If a real serpent comes, they say, "Kill, kill." I mean, that just cuts right to the heart of it, doesn't it? He's calling out the hypocrisy of worshipping a stone idol while showing cruelty to a living creature. His whole movement, the Shaivas, took on everything: caste, ideas of purity and pollution, even how people were buried. It's no wonder they attracted such a huge following from people who had been pushed to the margins. And it wasn't just men who were leading this charge. Women saints were forging their own incredible paths. Take Kuri Kal Amrayar. This description is just wow. She totally rejected the standard role of being a beautiful, quiet wife. Instead, she embraced this fierce, almost demonic form, giving up everything that society expected of a woman, all for her devotion to Shiva. Her very existence was a radical statement. Okay, so while all of this is bubbling up within the Hindu tradition, another powerful mystical current starts to flow into India. We're talking about Sufism. And what's so fascinating is that it didn't come in to replace what was already there. Instead, it found this incredibly welcoming home, and it began to weave itself right into the spiritual tapestry of the land. So what is Sufism really? Well, at its heart, it's the mystical side of Islam. And just like the Bhakti saints, the goal for a Sufi is a direct, personal, one-on-one experience with God. They weren't so interested in rigid rules or worldly wealth. For them, the path was all about love, intense devotion, and interpreting sacred texts through the lens of their own profound mystical experiences. And the central hub for all of this was a place called the Khanqa. But don't just picture a quiet monastery. This was a buzzing community center. It was a hospice, a school, a shelter, all rolled into one. You'd have a spiritual master, a sheikh, teaching his followers, but you'd also have people from every imaginable background: soldiers, merchants, poets, poor families, coming for advice, for a hot meal, or just for a safe place to rest. It was the heart of the community. Now, one Sufi order, the Chistis, became incredibly influential. And why? Because they were masters of integration. They didn't stand apart, they dove right in. They spoke Hindi, the local language, they were open to local practices, even adopting things like yogic exercises. They used music, what they called sama, to create this incredible feeling of divine ecstasy. And maybe most importantly, their kitchens, their langars, were open to everyone, no matter their religion or class. It was universal love put into practice every single day. And if you want one person who perfectly captures this beautiful blending of traditions, it has to be Kabir. Just listen to his words here. He just slices through all the religious divides with such brilliant simplicity. Allah, Ram, Kareem, he's saying, look, these are just different names for the exact same thing. For Kabir, the divisions we create between faiths, they're just made up words. The reality behind them is one and the same. All right, so you've got these hugely popular movements with mass appeal. What happens next? Well, you can bet the people in power started to notice. The kings and sultans couldn't ignore them. And this kicks off a really fascinating and often tricky dance between political power and spiritual authority. And you can see the tension right away. On the one hand, the rulers kind of needed the saints. If a king could get a popular saint on his side, it gave him a ton of credibility and public support. It made his rule look legitimate. But on the other hand, the saints didn't get their authority from any king. Their authority came directly from God, so many of them were very, very careful to keep politics at arm's length. They might accept gifts for their community, but they didn't want to get tangled up in the world of power and wealth. A perfect example of this comes from the Chola kings in the south. They built these absolutely magnificent temples to honor the Nayanar saints. And on the surface, that's great, right? They're honoring these beloved figures. But they were also doing something else. By funding these huge projects, they were basically shouting from the rooftops about their own power and piety. It was a clever way to link their rule directly to the divine. But then you get the flip side, and this story is just fantastic. A sultan comes to Sheikh Faridi Inn and offers him a huge gift of money and land deeds. The sheikh says, okay, I'll take the money for my community, for the poor, but the land deeds, he completely refused them. He told the sultan to give them to someone who actually wanted them. What a powerful way to say, my authority is not for sale, it doesn't come from you or your land. You might be wondering, how do we still have these poems and songs hundreds of years later? Well, thankfully, these amazing oral traditions were eventually written down. Followers and successors took on the huge task of compiling them into sacred books. You've got the Tevaram, which collected the Nayanar hymns, and later the Adi Granth Sahib, the holy book of Sikhism, which brought together the words of Guru Nanak, Kabir, and so many others. That's how this incredible legacy was preserved. So when you boil it all down, what's the lasting message here? I think it's one of radical, defiant hope. The idea that anyone, it doesn't matter who you are, where you come from, what your social status is, can have a direct personal connection to the divine. That love is always, always more powerful than rigid rules. And that all the walls we build to divide ourselves, caste, religion, gender, they just crumble and become meaningless when you're talking about that ultimate connection. And that really leaves us with something to think about, doesn't it? Our world today, it can feel just as divided as it was back then. These poets and saints, they had an answer. They saw love as a bridge that could cross any divide. So the question I want to leave you with is this. What bridges can their words, their ideas, still help us build right here, right now?